The second I walked through the oak gate of the Reed Vineyard, I knew I'd either just stepped into my future or into a story I'd regret for years. Diane Reed looked me over denim jacket, plain boots. No design or anything then gave that tight little smile people use when they've already decided your value. Someone near the tasting room laughed. Staff entrance is around the back. I didn't correct them. I just nodded, took it in, and thought, perfect. Now I get to see who they are when they think I'm nobody. If you're already feeling that sting, hit like, share this with someone who's been judged too, and subscribe because you're going to want to see what happens next. I should probably explain something before you decide what kind of person I am. I didn't show up that day dressed simply because I didn't care, and I didn't stay quiet because I didn't notice what was happening. I noticed everything. I always do. I learned a long time ago that the version of you people treat the worst is often the most honest version they ever meet. I've had money for years, not the loud kind, not the kind that changes how strangers greet you or how waiters suddenly remember your name. Just enough that I never had to panic about rent or accept disrespect because I needed someone's approval, and because of that safety. I had the privilege of learning something uncomfortable early on the moment people think you need them. The rules change. So I stopped letting that moment happen too soon. I didn't hide my life to play games. I hid it to protect it. There's a difference, and it matters more than people realize. When you walk into a room leading with titles, salaries, or accomplishments, people don't see you first. They see opportunity. They start running quiet calculations in their heads. How useful are you? How impressive are you? How much access do you give them by association? That kind of attention feels flattering at first. Then it starts to feel heavy. I didn't want to be evaluated based on what I could provide. I wanted to be seen or not seen based on who I was when there was nothing obvious to gain. So I learned to walk in neutral, no embellishments, no explanations unless they were asked for, no correcting assumptions that people were too eager to make. And when people thought I had nothing, something interesting always happened. They showed me who they were. Some people stayed polite, not warm, not cold, just decent. Those people stood out more than they know. Others became distant, dismissive, or casually unkind in ways they probably didn't even register. Those moments were never dramatic. They were quiet. A joke that didn't quite land. A question that wasn't really a question. A smile that didn't reach the eyes. That's where the truth lives. My father used to talk about this, long before I ever had the words for it. He kept a small notebook in the kitchen drawer. It wasn't sentimental looking. No leather cover. No inspiring quotes on the front. Just a plain, battered thing he wrote in at night. After he passed, I kept it. Inside were short entries, observations, rules he lived by but never lectured anyone about. One line is underlined twice, in his messy handwriting. Pay attention to how people behave when there's nothing in it for them. He believed character didn't show up under pressure or praise. It showed up in indifference, in moments where no reward was offered and no consequence was expected. That idea stayed with me, so when I met Ethan, and later when I stepped onto his family's property, I didn't feel the need to present a resume of my life. I answered honestly, but briefly. I didn't volunteer details to steer impressions. If someone assumed something about me, I let that assumption breathe. Not to punish them later, to understand them now. There's a line people cross when they talk about testing others, and I want to be clear about this. I wasn't setting traps. I wasn't waiting for anyone to fail so I could feel superior. That kind of mindset poisons you long before it affects anyone else. What I was doing was quieter than that. I was observing, There's a difference between hiding to manipulate and hiding to protect. Manipulation is about control. Protection is about boundaries. I wasn't trying to control outcomes. I was trying to make sure I wasn't giving access to people who hadn't earned it. Because once you reveal everything up front, you can't take it back. People like to say, if they loved you, it wouldn't matter. That's comforting. But it's not always true. Love doesn't automatically cancel entitlement. Affection doesn't prevent people from changing how they treat you once they think your value has shifted. So I paid attention to the small things. Who talked over me when they thought my opinion carried no weight? Who asked questions only to confirm what they'd already decided? Who warmed up the moment they thought I might be useful? And every time, I asked myself the same question. If this person suddenly knew everything about me, would their behavior change? If the answer was yes, then whatever kindness appeared afterward wouldn't be real. It would be recalculated. That's the part most people don't want to hear. Respect that arrives after revelation isn't respect. It's adjustment. That doesn't mean people can't grow or reflect. But it does mean you have to be careful about what you mistake for sincerity. Sudden interest, sudden warmth, sudden praise, those things feel good. But they don't erase how someone treated you when they believed you didn't matter. So no, I didn't walk into that vineyard pretending to be small. I walked in without armor. I walked in as someone who didn't need admiration, didn't need approval, and didn't need to be impressive to feel secure. I walked in wanting one thing only: clarity. Clarity about who I was dealing with. Clarity about what kind of respect was being offered. Clarity about what would happen if the truth ever came out. And standing there, under that oak gate, hearing the laughter and the assumptions, I already had my answer. The truth wouldn't need to be loud later. It wouldn't need theatrics or anger or revenge. It would just need to be placed carefully where it could no longer be ignored. The thing about that first meeting is that nothing was openly cruel. No one raised their voice. No one insulted me to my face. If you were watching from the outside, you might have thought it was pleasant, polite, even. But politeness can still cut. It started with questions that sounded harmless. Where I grew up, what my parents did, whether I'd ever worked with wine people before. Each question landed softly, but they all pointed in the same direction. They weren't trying to know me. They were trying to place me. Diane asked most of them. She did it with a smile that never slipped, like this was all friendly conversation. But I noticed how her eyes sharpened after every answer, like she was checking boxes I couldn't see. Lauren joined in too. She asked what I liked to drink, then laughed when I said I preferred simple reds. Oh, she said, like it explained something. You'll learn. I didn't argue. I didn't try to impress her. I just nodded and took another sip of water. Ethan sat beside me, quiet. He smiled when he was supposed to. He laughed when everyone else laughed, and when the conversation drifted into territory that made my shoulders tense. He didn't step in. He didn't correct anyone. He didn't redirect. He just stayed neutral. That's when I realized something important. This wasn't about whether they liked me. It was about whether they thought I belonged. There's a difference. Belonging, in their world, wasn't about character or values. It was about signals, how you spoke, what you knew, what you were familiar with, whether you matched the image they were comfortable presenting to others. And I didn't. Not because I was doing anything wrong, but because I wasn't performing. They didn't push me away. They simply lowered me a few steps on an invisible ladder I hadn't known existed until that moment. The tone shifted. The warmth cooled. The attention moved around me instead of toward me. That's how conditional respect works. It doesn't announce itself. It adjusts. You're still invited to the table. You're just not asked your opinion anymore. You're still spoken to, just not taken seriously. You're still smiled at, but the smile has an expiration date. I watched it happen in real time. When I answered simply, the questions became sharper. When I didn't expand on my background, assumptions filled the space. And when I didn't rush to correct those assumptions, something in the room relaxed, as if they'd found the category they needed me to fit into. That was the moment I understood the rules. They weren't disrespecting me because I lacked something. They were comfortable disrespecting me because they believed I couldn't affect them. That's what people mean when they say respect is earned. But that word gets misused. What was happening here wasn't respect being earned. It was value being calculated. And calculations change when the numbers change. I could feel it in the pauses, in the way Diane answered questions for me instead of letting me speak, in the way Lauren explained things slowly, like she was doing me a favor, in the way conversations stopped when I approached and resumed once I stepped back. None of it was dramatic enough to call out, which is exactly why it works. If you've ever been in a room like that, you know the feeling. You start questioning yourself. You wonder if you're being sensitive. You tell yourself it's probably nothing, that you should just relax and be grateful you're included at all. I didn't do that. I did something else instead. I paid attention. I paid attention to how quickly courtesy turned into condescension once they thought I had no leverage. I paid attention to who checked in with me when conversations shifted, and who didn't notice when I went quiet. I paid attention to how often Ethan looked at his mother before responding to me. And I remembered something my father wrote in that old notebook of his. Watch how people behave when there's no reward attached. That line came back to me as clearly as if he'd said it out loud, because what I was seeing wasn't hatred. It was indifference dressed up as manners. It was a system where kindness was optional and respect was transactional. They weren't being mean. They were being honest. Honest about what they valued. Honest about who they listened to. Honest about how quickly they would dismiss someone they believed couldn't offer them anything. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me calm. Because once you understand that respect in some rooms is conditional, you stop chasing it. You stop over-explaining. You stop shrinking or stretching yourself to fit. You observe. You gather evidence. You let people finish telling you who they are. I sat there, hands folded, answering when spoken to, saying less instead of more. And with every passing minute, the picture became clearer. This wasn't a family dinner. It was an evaluation. And in their eyes, I had already failed. The question wasn't whether they were right. The question was, what would happen when the conditions changed? And I didn't have to imagine the answer. I just had to wait. I didn't understand the full scope of what was happening until the conversation shifted away from the table. It happened the next morning, over coffee, when Ethan mentioned a meeting he had later that day. Not a family meeting, a community one, farmers, local officials, a few investors from outside the county, people who decided things. I asked what the meeting was about. He hesitated, just long enough for me to notice. Expansion plans. He said, it's mostly logistical stuff. Then Diane walked in and finished the sentence for him. Things you wouldn't be interested in, she said lightly. It's all very technical. She didn't say it unkindly. She said it like a fact. And that was the moment it clicked. This wasn't just about how I was treated inside their family. This was about who was allowed into the circle where decisions were made. Not dinners, not introductions, decisions. I started paying closer attention after that. The vineyard wasn't just a business. It was tied into the entire area: water rights, seasonal labor, property values, local permits. Every expansion shifted something for someone else. And yet, whenever those topics came up, the conversations happened around me. not with me. People spoke freely when they thought I wasn't relevant. They used words like we and the community, but they meant a very specific group, a closed one. I asked a question once, just one. What happens to the water table if you extend into the lower acreage? The room went quiet. Diane smiled again. That same polite smile. Oh, that's all been accounted for, she said. Our consultants are handling it. That was the end of the discussion. No follow-up. No explanation. No curiosity about why I'd asked. Later, a neighbor stopped by the property. Someone who'd lived there for decades. He talked about wells running dry in the summer, about workers who relied on the harvest season to get by, about land prices creeping higher every year. He spoke to me like I was invisible until Diane joined us. Then his posture changed. His tone shifted. He directed every word to her. I stood there, holding my cup, listening. That's when I realized something else. I wasn't being excluded because I was an outsider. I was being excluded because I didn't fit their idea of who had a right to influence outcomes. Diane didn't see herself as controlling anything. She saw herself as protecting a system where people like her decided what was best, and everyone else adapted. She was the gatekeeper, not just of her family, but of the narrative. Who was informed? Who was consulted? Who was allowed to ask questions? And who wasn't? The more I watched, the clearer it became. This wasn't personal. It was structural. If you didn't signal status in the right way, your concerns were treated as noise. If you weren't visibly useful, your voice didn't carry weight. And I wasn't signaling anything. I was dressed simply. I spoke carefully. I didn't name credentials or connections. I didn't claim space. So I was categorized quickly, safe to ignore. That realization changed how I saw everything else. The comments, the jokes, the polite distance. They weren't random. They were consistent with a worldview that ranked people before listening to them. Ethan knew all of this. On some level, he'd grown up inside it. I watched him defer without thinking. I watched him glance at his mother before agreeing to anything. I watched him avoid conflict by letting decisions be made elsewhere. And I understood then that this wasn't just a family dynamic. It was power wearing the costume of tradition. People like to believe these systems are neutral, that they're just how things work. But they only feel neutral if you benefit from them. If you don't, they feel very personal. I didn't confront anyone. Not yet. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't demand inclusion. I took notes instead. I noted which decisions were framed as community-minded and which voices were missing from the room. I noted how often risk was mentioned when it came to expansion, but never when it came to impact. I noted how easily concerns were dismissed once the speaker was deemed irrelevant. And I asked myself a question I'd learned to ask in moments like this. If the truth were known, if people understood who I was, what I'd worked on, what I'd been invited into elsewhere, would these conversations sound the same? I already knew the answer. And that's when I stopped thinking of this as a relationship problem. This was a power problem. A system that decided whose future mattered and whose didn't. A system that labeled some people too small to be consulted, then used the consequences of that exclusion as proof that the system worked. Standing there, watching it unfold, I felt something settle inside me. Not anger, clarity. Because once you see how power actually moves quietly, politely, through closed doors, you stop mistaking exclusion for misunderstanding. They hadn't forgotten to include me. They had decided not to. And that meant one thing. If the truth was ever going to matter, it wouldn't be enough to say it privately. It would have to be said where it could no longer be filtered, softened, or ignored. and I wasn't ready to do that yet. But I was getting closer. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I was looking for the restroom, and I took a wrong turn near the wine cellar. The door was half open. The light inside was low, and voices carried more clearly than they probably expected. I recognized Diane's voice immediately, calm, controlled, like she was explaining something obvious to a child. "This phase has served its purpose," she said. There was a pause. I heard the soft clink of glass, someone swirling wine. Ethan spoke next. His voice was quieter than usual. "Careful. I know," he said. "I just need a little more time. Time." That word landed heavier than anything else. Diane didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "You've had time," she replied. "What you need now is alignment. The investors are asking questions. And optics matter. Optics." I stood still, one hand on the cold stone wall, listening. Lauren laughed softly, not cruelly, almost bored. "She's harmless," she said. "Everyone thinks she's temporary anyway." Temporary. They weren't whispering. They were discussing logistics. Diane continued, as if this were a business meeting, which, I realized, it was. "The Reed family doesn't make commitments without long-term value," she said. "You know that. This situation was always transitional." I waited for Ethan to say my name. He didn't. Instead, he sighed. "I just don't want this to get messy." Messy. That's when I understood. I wasn't a person in this conversation. I was a variable, a buffer, a placeholder, something that filled space until the right arrangement could be finalized. They talked about the other woman next, not by name, by credentials, her background, her family connections, how well she'd be received. "She fits," Diane said. "She understands how things work," Lauren added. "And she won't ask inconvenient questions." I felt my throat tighten then, not because of what they said, but because of how easily they said it. There was no malice in their tone, no guilt, no urgency, just certainty. That's what made it worse. If they'd sounded angry, I could have dismissed it as emotion. If they'd sounded defensive, I could have assumed insecurity. But this was planning. They spoke about me the way people talk about furniture that's about to be replaced. Useful for now, not worth repairing. Ethan finally said something that told me everything I needed to know. "She doesn't need to know all this," he said. "There's no reason to hurt her." Hurt. As if ignorance were kindness. As if being used quietly were somehow gentler than being told the truth. Diane agreed. "Exactly. We're not cruel people. This is just how things are done." That sentence stayed with me. This is just how things are done. That's how systems excuse themselves. They don't call it manipulation. They call it tradition. They don't call it exploitation. They call it strategy. They don't call it using someone. They call it avoiding discomfort. I stepped back before they noticed me. I didn't rush. I didn't feel dizzy. I didn't feel weak. I felt cold, not numb, clear. I walked away slowly, my footsteps steady, my breathing even. I didn't cry in the hallway. I didn't run to the bathroom. I didn't confront anyone, because there was nothing to confront yet. What I had just heard wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a miscommunication. It wasn't something that could be fixed with a conversation. It was a plan. And plans don't unravel because of feelings. They unravel because of consequences. As I walked back toward the main house, I noticed details I'd missed before. The way decisions were made without consensus. The way Ethan deferred without realizing he was doing it. The way Diane spoke for everyone, including him. This wasn't a family protecting its values. It was a system protecting itself. And I had been allowed inside only because I didn't threaten it. Until now, that was the moment something shifted. Not outwardly, not yet, but inside me. Something settled into place. I stopped wondering whether I was overreacting. I stopped replaying conversations, trying to find kinder interpretations. I stopped asking myself if I'd misunderstood the tone. I hadn't. They weren't confused about me. They were clear, and clarity, once you have it, changes how you move. I didn't feel the need to expose them immediately. I didn't feel the urge to prove my worth. I didn't feel angry enough to make mistakes. What I felt was resolve. Because when someone shows you they're willing to use you quietly, the worst thing you can do is respond loudly and without preparation. I wasn't dealing with a hurtful comment or a thoughtless remark. I was dealing with intent, and intent requires evidence. So I went back into the room. I smiled when spoken to. I listened. I asked nothing. If you had looked at me then, you would have thought nothing had changed, but everything had. Because I finally understood what role they had written for me, and once you know the role, you can decide whether to keep playing it or rewrite the scene entirely. I hadn't decided yet, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened next wouldn't be accidental, and it wouldn't be quiet. There was a moment after I heard everything after the words temporary and optics had settled in that I stopped thinking about Diane and Lauren altogether. I started thinking about Ethan, not about what his family expected of him, not about how he'd been raised, just about him, about us. 14 months is a long time to be with someone and not really know them, but it's an even longer time to be with someone who never tries. I replayed the small moments first, the harmless ones, the ones I'd brushed off because they didn't feel important at the time. He never asked what my days actually looked like. He asked how work was. Sure, but not what I worked on. Not what problems I solved. Not what excited me enough to keep me up late with a laptop and cold coffee. When I talked about challenges, he nodded. When I mentioned travel, he assumed it was personal. When I mentioned meetings, he assumed they were internal. He filled in the blanks with the version of me that fit neatly into his life, and I let him. For a while, I told myself that was normal, that not everyone is curious, that not everyone needs details to feel close, but there's a difference between privacy and invisibility. If a man respects you, he wants to understand your world, not control it, not manage it, just see it clearly. He asks follow-up questions. He remembers what matters to you. He notices patterns. He picks up on the way you think, not just the role you play when you're with him. And Ethan didn't. That realization hurt more than anything his family had said. Because here's the uncomfortable truth I had to face. I didn't hide my life so well that he couldn't see it. He simply didn't look. You can hide money. You can hide numbers. You can hide titles. But you can't hide discipline. You can't hide the way you organize your time. You can't hide how you approach problems, or how you speak when you're confident, or how you move through the world when you're used to responsibility. Those things leak out, unless someone isn't paying attention. I thought back to how often he changed the subject when conversations got deeper, how quickly he deferred decisions to others, how comfortable he was letting assumptions stand if they kept things easy. He wasn't blind, he was selective. And that's a different kind of choice. If you really love someone, curiosity comes naturally. You want to know what shaped them, what pressures them, what they're proud of but don't brag about. Ethan loved how I made his life feel. Calm, uncomplicated, supportive. He loved the version of me that didn't ask for much. He loved that I didn't challenge him. And that's when something shifted for me. Because suddenly, It wasn't just his family benefiting from the misunderstanding. He was too. As long as I stayed small in his mind, he didn't have to rise. He didn't have to explain his choices. He didn't have to defend me when it mattered. He didn't have to confront his mother or push back against a system that made decisions for him. Ambiguity was comfortable. My silence made things easier. That's not being controlled. That's cooperating. I had spent so much time framing him as passive, as caught in the middle, that I hadn't considered the possibility that he preferred it that way. Not because he was cruel, but because clarity demands action, and action has consequences. If he acknowledged who I really was, what I was capable of, what I understood, what I questioned, then he would have had to choose between me and the version of his life that required me to stay convenient, between honesty and comfort, between love and alignment. And he never made that choice. Because as long as he didn't know, really know, he could tell himself he wasn't doing anything wrong. That's the thing people don't talk about enough. Not knowing isn't always an accident. Sometimes it's a strategy. When you avoid information, you avoid responsibility. When you don't ask questions, you don't have to act on the answers. So no, the mystery of how he didn't know stopped bothering me. The real question became simpler and much harder to ignore. Did he want to know? And once I asked myself that, the answer came quickly. If he had wanted to see me clearly, he would have. If he had wanted to understand my world, he would have asked. If he had wanted to protect me, he would have noticed the warning signs long before I did. Love doesn't require perfect awareness, but it does require attention. And attention is a choice. Standing there, replaying every moment through that lens, I felt something settle into place again. The same calm I'd felt after hearing the conversation in the cellar. This wasn't betrayal born from weakness. It was benefit born from silence. And that meant whatever came next wouldn't just be about exposing a family. It would be about confronting a man who had been very comfortable not seeing the full picture as long as it served him. The consequences of that choice were coming. And for the first time, I knew exactly who they were for. The announcement came casually, like it hadn't been rehearsed. We were standing near the long wooden table where they'd laid out the tasting bottles, the late afternoon light coming through the windows, making everything look warmer than it felt. People were talking in clusters, laughing, holding glasses by the stem like it mattered. Ethan cleared his throat. He didn't look at me at first. He looked at his mother. Then he smiled and put his arm around my waist. "I just want to say something quickly," he said. "Before the fundraiser next week?" The room quieted the way it always does when someone important decides to speak. "I know we've kept things low-key," he continued, squeezing my side gently. "But Naomi and I are serious, very serious. And I'm looking forward to having her more involved with the family." There it was. Not a question, not a conversation, a statement. People smiled. Someone clapped softly. Diane nodded, approving, like a plan had just been confirmed on schedule. I felt eyes turn toward me, measuring, reassessing. This was the moment people expect you to hesitate, to pull away, to correct the narrative. I didn't. I smiled too. I nodded once and leaned into him. Just enough, because I understood something very clearly then. If I said no, privately, it would disappear. If I objected quietly, it would be reframed. If I walked away, it would be explained for me. But if I said yes here out loud, in front of witnesses, it created a record. And truth, I'd learned, only creates consequences when it has an audience. I met Ethan's eyes for the first time since he'd started talking. "Of course," I said. "I'm happy to be here." The relief on his face was immediate, not joy. Relief, like a problem had just solved itself. People relaxed again. Conversations restarted. Someone handed me a glass of wine I didn't ask for. Diane stepped closer and kissed my cheek, her voice low. "You'll do wonderfully," she said. "Just enjoy the evening. Enjoy." I took a sip and let the room settle around me. I could feel the discomfort this created for the viewer, for anyone listening closely. That instinctive question forming, why did she agree? It looked like compliance. It sounded like surrender, but it wasn't either. I wasn't saying yes to the relationship. I was saying yes to the stage, because the truth doesn't carry weight when it's whispered. It needs context, timing, the right room. And this was the right room. I watched how quickly people adjusted their behavior, how the tone changed, how the smiles became warmer now that I'd been labeled correctly. Someone asked where I was from again, this time with interest. Someone else asked what I thought about the expansion, as if my opinion had suddenly materialized. Nothing about me had changed, only their understanding of my relevance. That told me everything I needed to know. Ethan stayed close the rest of the evening, attentive, proud, even, as if announcing seriousness had restored order. And maybe it had, for him, but for me, something else was happening. Every word he'd said was now attached to witnesses. Every promise had been placed in public space. Every assumption had been endorsed out loud, which meant it couldn't be quietly undone later. That's the part people miss. Saying yes in private protects the other person. Saying yes in public protects the truth. Because once something is spoken in front of people who matter, it stops being flexible. It becomes accountable. I didn't feel hopeful standing there. I felt focused. I thought about my father's notebook, about the line he underlined twice, about how character shows up when there's nothing to gain, and how it also shows up when there's something to lose. Ethan thought he'd secured certainty. Diane thought she'd stabilized the image. Lauren thought this was another box checked. None of them realized what had actually happened. By saying yes in that room, I hadn't agreed to anything quietly. I had placed the truth exactly where it would be hardest to ignore later. Because when the moment comes, and it always does, the difference between a misunderstanding and a consequence is witnesses. And now, there were plenty. The room moved on. The tasting continued. Laughter filled the space again. I stood there, glass in hand, surrounded by people who believed the future had just been confirmed. They were right, just not in the way they thought. The fundraiser felt less like a celebration and more like a performance. There were cameras from the local paper, a few familiar faces from the county council, and people I recognized from previous community meetings, the ones who usually spoke last, and whose opinions carried the most weight. The vineyard looked the same as it always did, but the atmosphere was different, sharper, more deliberate. I wore the same clothes I always did. Simple jacket, neutral colors, nothing that asked for attention. The only thing that didn't fit was the watch on my wrist. It had belonged to my father, old, scratched. The leather strap had been replaced more than once. It didn't look expensive unless you knew what you were looking at. Most people didn't. At first, nothing changed. Diane moved through the crowd like she owned the air around her. Ethan stayed close, attentive in a way that felt rehearsed. Lauren laughed too loudly at the right moments. Then introductions started. Someone from the council shook my hand and paused when he noticed the watch. "I haven't seen one of these in years," he said. "Is that a yes?" I replied, "It is." His expression shifted, not dramatically, just enough. Another man joined us, then another. Questions followed. Not about where I was from, but about what I thought, about water usage, about soil runoff, about how expansion would affect the smaller farms nearby. I answered calmly, briefly. I didn't lecture. I didn't posture. I referenced data. The room changed without anyone announcing it. Diane noticed. I saw it in the way her posture tightened, just slightly. She stepped closer, tried to redirect the conversation toward donations and legacy. It didn't work. Someone asked about environmental impact reports. Someone else asked about financing transparency. Questions Diane wasn't used to answering publicly. I spoke again, not over her, not against her, but clearly. I was invited to consult on a sustainable development proposal for this area last year. I said. I declined. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was alert. Diane turned to me, surprised despite herself. You were... Yes, I said. I didn't feel comfortable lending my name to a project unless the community had real input. That was true. I hadn't said no out of spite. I'd said no because I didn't want to become a shield, something respectable placed in front of decisions that would hurt people who didn't have microphones. The journalist nearby wrote that down. I didn't look at Ethan. I didn't need to. This wasn't about revealing my worth. It was about revealing the structure. Because once you understand how power moves, you stop mistaking personal slights for personal problems. This wasn't a family drama. It was a system that sorted people by usefulness and called it tradition. And systems don't collapse when you shout at them. They shift when they're forced to answer questions in public. Diane spoke again, carefully. She chose her words the way people do when they realize they're no longer in control of the narrative. I listened. Then I asked one more question. Not confrontational, not emotional, just precise. The kind of question that demands documentation. The room stayed quiet. This was the moment people had been waiting for without knowing it. The point where things stop being theoretical and start being accountable. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I let the facts sit where everyone could see them. For the first time, I wasn't being evaluated. I was being heard. And I realized something then that surprised even me. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. Because this wasn't revenge. It was alignment. I wasn't trying to win against a family. I was making sure no one else in that room would be treated like a placeholder again, useful until inconvenient. Welcome until questioning. The watch caught the light as I lowered my hand. It wasn't there to impress anyone. It was there to remind me of something my father wrote once. In the margin of a notebook I still keep. Character doesn't show up when people admire you. It shows up when you refuse to be useful at the wrong cost. That night didn't end with applause, or outrage, or confrontation. It ended with people thinking differently about who belonged in the conversation. And sometimes, that's the loudest consequence of all. After everything settled down, there was no rush of victory, no relief, no urge to celebrate. The room emptied slowly. Conversations broke apart. People left with polite smiles and unanswered questions. I stood there longer than I needed to, holding the same glass, watching the noise dissolve into quiet. That's when it hit me. What hurt the most wasn't what they said when they underestimated me. It was how normal it all felt to them. They didn't see themselves as cruel. They didn't think of their behavior as unfair. In their minds, they were just responding to signals, clothes, accents, familiarity. The things society quietly teaches us to read as value. That's how this works. We like to believe we judge people by character, but most of the time, we judge by shortcuts. We decide who deserves patience, curiosity, and respect based on how easily we can place them on a mental ladder. And if someone lands a few steps below us, we feel entitled to speak down, or not listen at all. Standing there, I understood something I hadn't fully named before. Living simply didn't make me invisible. It made other people uncomfortable, because simplicity doesn't explain itself. It doesn't compete. It doesn't beg for validation. And that unsettles people who rely on external proof to feel secure. When someone looks at you and can't immediately tell where you rank, they rush to assign you somewhere, often lower. Not because you belong there, but because it protects their sense of order. That realization was oddly freeing. It meant there was nothing wrong with me. I hadn't failed some unspoken test. I hadn't missed a cue. I hadn't been naive for choosing a quieter life. I had simply refused to broadcast, and that refusal forced others to reveal what they truly respected. I thought back to how quiet I'd been earlier, how many moments I'd let pass without correction, how often I'd chosen to listen instead of defend myself. From the outside, it probably looked like passivity. It wasn't. There's a kind of silence that comes from fear, the kind where you swallow words because you don't believe they'll matter. And then there's a silence that comes from clarity, the kind where you're waiting, watching, collecting evidence. I wasn't quiet because I felt small. I was quiet because I knew timing mattered. If I had spoken earlier alone, dismissed, unsupported, it would have been easy to explain me away. Emotional, oversensitive, misunderstanding intent. Silence bought me context. Silence bought me witnesses. Silence bought me consequences. That's the difference people rarely talk about. Endurance without strategy drains you. Silence with intention protects you. And when the moment finally came, the truth didn't need embellishment. It didn't need anger. It didn't need volume. It just needed to be placed where it couldn't be ignored. I saw the shift after, not in apologies. Those were scarce. But in behavior, people asked different questions. They listened longer. They stopped explaining things to me slowly. Nothing about me had changed. Only their perception of my relevance. And that's the part I want to sit with for a moment. If respect appears only after you prove status, wealth, or leverage, it was never respect. It was conditional tolerance. Real respect doesn't arrive late. It doesn't need recalculating. It doesn't depend on what you can offer. It shows up early, quietly, consistently. If someone treats you well only after discovering your value, what they're really admitting is that they didn't see your humanity before. And that isn't something you need to earn. It's something you're allowed to walk away from. I didn't leave that night feeling powerful. I left feeling clear. Clear about the systems we mistake for tradition. Clear about how often simplicity is misread as weakness. Clear about how dangerous it is to build your life around approval that can be revoked the moment conditions change. If you've ever been underestimated because you didn't perform success the right way, if you've ever been talked down to because you didn't signal enough, if you've ever stayed quiet, wondering whether you should have spoken sooner, I want you to hear this. Being judged incorrectly doesn't mean you are incorrect. Sometimes, it means you've been standing in front of people who need you to be smaller so they can feel larger. And silence, when chosen deliberately, is not surrender. It's positioning. The truth doesn't need to chase respect. It just needs to be heard at the right moment. And once it is, everything else rearranges itself naturally, inevitably. That's where real respect lives, not in noise, not in performance, but in what remains when the room finally goes quiet. I didn't leave that vineyard feeling like I'd won anything. I left without applause, without an argument, without anyone chasing after me to explain themselves. I walked out the same way I walked in, quietly, carrying only what I came with: my dignity, my boundaries, the truth. That matters more than people think, because revenge looks dramatic. It makes noise. It asks for witnesses. But choosing yourself rarely does. It usually looks boring from the outside. A simple decision, a closed door, a life redirected. I didn't walk away as a queen who burned bridges. I walked away as an adult who finally understood what kind of respect is worth keeping. Here's the part I want to be very clear about. Respect that arrives after you prove your status is not a reward. It's a confession. It's people admitting they didn't see you as fully human before they knew what you could offer them. And that kind of respect is fragile. It disappears the moment circumstances change, the moment the numbers shift, the moment you stop being useful. I've seen how fast it evaporates. So I didn't build my life around it. I didn't stay to negotiate better treatment. I didn't stay to demand apologies. I didn't stay to prove I was worth it. Because if someone needs evidence of your value before they treat you well, they were never offering respect in the first place. They were offering tolerance, conditional tolerance, and that's a dangerous thing to base your life on. Walking away wasn't dramatic. It was practical. It meant choosing spaces where I didn't have to shrink to be accepted. Relationships where curiosity came before calculation. Rooms where my voice didn't need credentials attached to it to be heard. Those places exist. But you don't find them by waiting for the wrong people to change. You find them by leaving. I think a lot of us stay too long because we confuse effort with loyalty, because we're taught that patience will eventually be rewarded, because we tell ourselves that if we just explain better, prove more, endure longer, things will shift. Sometimes they do. Often, they don't. And when they don't, it's not a failure on your part. It's information. Information about how that system works, about what it values, about where you stand when there's nothing to gain from standing beside you. I wish someone had told me earlier that being underestimated doesn't require immediate correction. You don't owe people a performance. You don't owe them access. You don't owe them proof. You owe yourself clarity. And once you have it, you owe yourself action. Not loud action, not reckless action, aligned action. Leaving when respect is conditional, staying where it's consistent, speaking when the truth has weight, and staying silent when silence protects you. That's not weakness. That's discernment. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, if you've ever been talked down to, overlooked, or suddenly taken seriously only after someone learned your title, your income, your connections, I want you to pause and ask yourself one thing. If nothing about me had changed, why did their behavior? The answer matters. And if you've ever walked away from a room knowing you'd never be fully respected there, even if you stayed long enough to earn it, know this: you didn't lose anything. You saved time. So before we end, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been judged wrong? Have you ever stayed quiet when you wish you'd spoken, or walked away when you wish you'd stayed and learned? Later you were right to leave. If you feel comfortable, share that moment, not to relive it, but to name it. Because the more we talk about conditional respect, the less power it has over us. And because choosing yourself doesn't always feel brave in the moment, sometimes it just feels necessary, and that's enough.